Thank you. So we're all born hardwired for curiosity. It's one of the things that's a drive in us, as innate as hunger or thirst. But the cool thing about curiosity is that there's no intrinsic reward, like having your hunger be sated or your thirst be slaked. Curiosity is its own reward. Curiosity can be defined as the recognition and pursuit, an intense desire to explore novel, challenging, or uncertain events and experiences. It's the thing that makes us want to know something. It's that inkling that has us wondering. Curiosity is linked in all sorts of research over the past 10 years to creativity, to academic performance. This is really fascinating. In a recent study, curiosity is the reason as much as intelligence for academic performance. It's correlated with academic success just as much as intelligence is. Think about that for a minute. It's not just about being smart. It's about asking questions and wondering. Curiosity is also linked to innovation. I'm sure that doesn't really come as a surprise, except it was really interesting in a study that people have found people who have the trait for curiosity and the trait for persistence together, it's curiosity and persistence that leads to innovation. So it's wanting to ask those questions, asking them, and then continuing to ask them. And finally, curiosity is linked to happiness. And maybe that comes as a surprise, maybe it doesn't. Curiosity, people who have that trait for curiosity have consistently report higher senses of well-being and sort of self-actualization. And also people in their 70s who have a trait for curiosity live 5 to 10 years longer than their peers who don't. So it actually is not only happiness, but it extends your life. And of course, when you're actually experiencing the state of curiosity, you get that little dopamine hit. It's amazing to be curious and to wonder and then to figure something out and then to wonder again. It makes you happy in that moment. So hi, I'm Christina, and I'm really passionate about curiosity. I've been curious my whole life, and I think one of the reasons that I feel like I maybe am justified to talk about curiosity is I was a middle kid. And so some of you are probably middle kids too, and you know that as a middle kid, you never think really that you're right because you know the whole time that there are other ways of thinking and being. You live in a reality in which you have other perspectives all the time. And for me, that meant that I had to learn from a very early age how to observe so closely all of the things that one sister thought so that then I could play it against the other sister. Sometimes I also kept the peace. Most of the time I tried to. But it's really that curiosity and that understanding of, oh wow, the world has so many different perspectives. And as a middle kid, that was just my reality. And it was something that continued on since then. I've always been incredibly fascinated by what makes people tick and how differently we all think. And my sisters are incredibly different people. The other thing that I think really contributes to my curiosity is not the pet squirrel, but the fact that I grew up without TV. I never had a TV in my house my entire childhood. And that might have been an advantage or a disadvantage, but what it did do was create a lot of space for boredom. There was a lot more time in my life that I had to fill with something. And boredom might be underrated, but it's great for curiosity. It's a condition for curiosity. And so this squirrel was one of those afternoons where I was bored and hanging out on the front porch, and I heard my cat making this really interesting noise, and just even the circumstances of being in that place at that time would have been different had I been doing something else, had I been in front of my TV watching a show. And so I found this little creature, which I didn't even question that would become my pet, and I don't have any idea what my parents thought of it, actually. I never asked them, but it became my pet. Point, going back to TV, is that I acquired this innate ability to really listen hard because I grew up without a whole cultural context that most people share. Humor, pop references, all sorts of things that most of you share with each other all the time, I didn't have. And so I had to overcompensate for that by paying attention really closely to what were they actually trying to say when they were referencing that show. So I can follow along with shows that I've never watched firsthand, but because I was always paying attention and it mattered so much to connect socially, to have all that I became curious in a different way because I didn't have TV. Also, fun fact, the average 32-and-a-half-year-old has spent 4 years, entire years, watching TV. That's a lot of time. That's like, a college education. Also adds up to be about 9 years by the time you're 65. Just an interesting thought. And it's actually fascinating. People still, even though we don't watch TV on the same screens that we used to, you'd think that maybe it's changing the amount of TV, but it's not. We're actually watching 5 hours a day on average, which if you think about it, it leaves a little bit less room for creativity and curiosity than you might think. So fast forward, I got a BFA in language, culture, and identity, and double majored in education, and then spent the next 7 years right out of undergrad teaching kids, first, second, third, seventh, and eighth graders. And that experience really put me at the front lines of where curiosity happens and how it changes as children get older. And even how when children come in first grade, they already assume that there's a right answer and they want to find it. And they raise their hand when they think they know it. It's not about asking questions. They've already learned by the time they're in first grade that it's not about asking questions, it's about having the right answer. And so it actually takes in a classroom and in wherever your workplace is, if you're leading a company or if you're collaborating with creators, it's the same thing. It takes intentional work to cultivate a culture of inquiry and curiosity. It's not something that you can just have because we are, as a society, completely driven to just sort of finding those right answers. So after about 7 years teaching, I ended up writing a book on paying attention called The Field Guide to Now. And during that process, really started to parse this idea of curiosity more and just how to pay attention in the moment. And a lot of the practices that I do daily that nurture my creativity came from working on that book. Had 2 kids and then went back to school for an MFA in emergent media, which has launched me into the past decade that I've spent working with all sorts of brands to help define their strategic positioning, to define their story, their messaging, their purpose, and really how to connect with people. So curiosity has been, for me, the thread that's held all of my pieces of my career together, even though it's been a very non-linear career. And it's the thing that every day as a strategist is my advantage. Curiosity is the thing that allows me to bring different kinds of people, different stakeholders in the room who have completely different agendas and perspectives together and get them to align. It's not an easy thing, but it's actually kind of an easy thing to start by asking questions. And so I'll go into that a little bit more in a minute, but one of the things that I've noticed over the past 10 years as digital media has become so prevalent and as we've acquired smartphones and all the other things, is that curiosity is really being endangered. It's really being threatened in an interesting way. And it's why I'm here today, actually, is to remind you about curiosity, and hopefully that when you leave, some inklings will stick in your head and you'll start to create a curiosity practice. So yeah, curiosity is slipping away from us as we live in a culture that's driven by Moore's Law. And you're all familiar with Moore's Law, and we experience it in our technology all the time. I mean, we all have these devices that do things that the devices of my childhood couldn't dream of doing. But the thing is, this idea of Moore's Law has changed what we expect every day, not just from our technology, but from people, from each other. It's made us start moving faster all the time. We expect fast wins, right? How many of you have heard that from somebody recently? Fast wins. That's what we want as businesses, as clients, from our collaboration partners. We want everything to be moving at that speed. But the challenge is, when you're just going for fast wins, you don't quite leave room for curiosity and exploration. And maybe a fast win gets you somewhere, but if you did a slow win that allowed for some different kinds of thinking, it would get you farther in the long run. And that's something that I watch all the time with all of the leaders that I'm currently working with. I'm head of brand at Vacasa, as Cecilia mentioned, helping to define what the future of modern vacation rental management looks like. It's a very fast-growing startup, and I live with this reality daily. And it's balancing it, because fast wins are important, but they're not the only thing that's important. So one of the ways that sort of fast culture has saturated our everyday is a sort of a craving for immediacy. We went from having 2-day shipping be something that seemed fast. Like, that was like 5 years ago. 2-day shipping was rad. And now it's like 2 hours? Man. You know? How that's changing us is really interesting. Our minds are actually changing because of the technology and the environment that we live in. It's so biased towards speed. And one of them is that now the average person makes a decision about something that they're reading or seeing in 8 seconds, whether it has value or purpose or not. So curiosity doesn't really thrive in 8 seconds. It doesn't leave a lot of room for curiosity. Studies show that the average millennial spends about 5 minutes before they want to switch to something else and do. So again, 5 minutes is longer than 8 seconds, but it's not a really long time. And so, again, curiosity doesn't really thrive when you're making those instant decisions. And I'm seeing that everywhere in my workplace. The other thing that's really influencing the decline of curiosity is our relationship with this device. It's an amazing relationship. I remember when I got my first smartphone, it was not an iPhone, and when it met its kind of untimely demise on the top of my car, and I watched it slide in the rearview mirror off the back and land in the middle of the road and then get run over, I didn't feel sad. But today I actually might feel sad if my iPhone fell off the back of my car, because I have a dependent relationship with that device. And there's some really interesting studies about the fact that we legitimately have separation anxiety from our devices. We get sweaty palms when our devices aren't near us. We feel anxious. It's amazing. But what that's also doing is our device is replacing looking up and talking to people and connecting with humans and connecting with all of our senses. Not maybe completely replacing. I'm in emergent media, I'm in technology because I love technology. I believe in it, and I believe in it to shape the world that we're in. At the same time, I think it's really important to pay attention to the relationships that we have with it. I was just in France, and this was a phenomenon that I saw everywhere. This woman never turned around. She never turned around. I watched her take that photo and walk out of that room. She never looked at the Mona Lisa. That's right there, behind her. The point was the picture. And it's interesting because we have these devices that do so many things. And one of the things that it's doing is it's shaping a relationship with the world that's sort of, we consume moments. We're not in the moments, we consume moments. So we have sort of a surface level curiosity. I'm fascinated by all the worlds of people's lives that I follow on Instagram. I mean, they're so fascinating. And I follow people from all around the world. And I think it's an incredible community. But at the same time, it's all at the surface and it's just snackable and consumable. She was in that moment because she was thinking about her audience. She wasn't in that moment. And so that relationship with our phones is definitely threatening curiosity. And so is the fact that we live, as I was saying, in an answer culture. We have so much information right at our fingertips all the time. My 9-year-old says, ask Siri at least once a day. And like, he really thinks that Siri knows the answers to questions that Siri couldn't possibly know the answer to. But like, he thinks Siri knows the answer to every question. And the problem with being in an answer culture is it implies that there's a right answer. And there isn't always. 90% of the data on the internet has been created since 2016. Think about that for a minute. Like, that was like yesterday. 90% of the data. Which means every single year, Moore's law is applying to information too, or even a more radical form of Moore's law. And so that means that we're surrounded and inundated by information. We have so much information. And we know how to type a search phrase in, but the funny thing is even with that, we're not very curious because Google takes care of the other half of the question for us, right? Like we type in the beginning and then Google types the end of the question. And so then we kind of know what most people think that are like us, you know, that live where we live and search the same types of things. But we don't really go a lot deeper than that. The average 4-year-old girl asks 390 questions a day. 390 questions. How many questions have you asked today so far? Think about it. It's fascinating to think about how many questions have you asked this week, if you could just sort of summarize backwards. It's probably a lot less than 300. It's probably a lot less than 50 for some of us. And I see that in my workplace every day, working with clients, the same thing. We are very interested in talking about what we believe, talking about our ideas, but less interested in asking questions. So, some things that you can do. Start by asking questions. That's the first thing. And then, I think for all of you, I hope that you all feel like maybe curiosity is something that you'll walk out of here today just wondering about, and that's already the seed of curiosity planted again. I have seven things that I personally think that are really important for curiosity. The first thing is ask questions as often as you advocate. And what I mean there is that, as I was saying, we're supposed to spend a lot of time, especially when we're presenting to clients and collaborating with each other. We're supposed to spend time advocating for what we believe. We're rewarded for being decisive and coming in saying, I think X or Y, and knowing exactly what we believe and what we want to push forward and being able to be decisive. And that's usually how meetings go, right? Think about that. There's a lot of that conversation that happens where it's just declaring. And the interesting thing is, if you spend a meeting doing that, by the end of the meeting, if all you've done is advocate for your own ideas, you've done nothing more than talk into a white room. right? Like you haven't actually created alignment, you haven't moved something forward, you haven't gathered any more information than you had before. And so you might be pushing your idea forward, but how are you supposed to know that it's the best that it could be, or even the right one, without asking questions to get that context? The second thing is put yourself in uncomfortable situations. And I make a practice of doing this. In fact, I've honed this ability to pay attention both at work and in my creative life to like when I feel a little afraid or uncomfortable or like it doesn't feel, I aim right for that, because that's going to put me in a place where I'm going to learn new information and I'm curious about what I'm going to learn there. And it definitely, it creates empathy, let's say, to put yourself in uncomfortable situations, to be a novice. And it's probably the most fast way to grow, is to put yourself in situations that are unfamiliar or uncomfortable. And I'm sure most of you have heard of Brené Brown. She's amazing. And one of the things that happens when you put yourself in an uncomfortable situation is you're vulnerable. And vulnerability is linked to connection and well-being and happiness too. So curiosity and vulnerability kind of go together. You have to want to be a little bit vulnerable to be curious. You have to be open to the idea that somebody might have a different perspective than you, that might be completely in opposition to your own ideas. And that is uncomfortable. Or you might have to be open to the fact that you'll have a hard conversation that isn't quite easy and comfortable, but because you've been direct and vulnerable and open, you'll build an emotional bond that's much deeper. And that comes from this state of curiosity and asking what if, and asking, well, why did you do that? I heard you saying X and Y and you seemed this way to me. Why was that? We don't spend a lot of time asking those questions. We leave with our impression of what we think you were saying. But we don't spend a lot of time saying, well, I heard you saying this. Why were you saying that? What was behind that? What are you afraid of? You know, those questions are big ones. Feeling curious appears, this is like my favorite quote from nerdy science research, appears to increase tolerance for the distressing states of self-awareness that result from trying new things and behaving in ways outside of one's comfort zone. So feeling curious is the balm for feeling uncomfortable. Once you move yourself from, oh, this is going to be uncomfortable, I'm going to be embarrassed, I'm going to be shy, to I'm curious what I'm going to feel like. I get to feel uncomfortable. I mean, think about that for a minute. That as humans, we get to have this huge range of emotions. And yet most of the time we're trying to just live in the ones that make us feel comfortable. But like, be curious about, for a minute, what it feels like to be uncomfortable or really sad or all the other range of emotions. Once you move into a state of curiosity about your own emotions, it changes and increases your tolerance for that state of discomfort. And finally, Joan Didion is a favorite, and one of the things she said is, of course, I found that if I examine something, it's less scary, if you bring real observation to it. And so doing that when you're feeling like you have to pitch a creative idea that you know isn't going to land, start being curious, or you know is going to be met with opposition. Start being curious, not about like how you can sharpen your pitch, but rather like who's in the room and what are they thinking about, and create that sense of empathy. That empathy and curiosity are very closely tied together. Finally, be additive. And this is one that I work with my teams on all the time, and I really believe in, and it's being able to listen in a room, be curious, and then say, yes, and then continue. It's a great improv thing, but it's true for curiosity, because what it does is acknowledge something in the room. It doesn't mean that you don't have to negate whatever you've heard. Say yes, and then say, and I'm curious about, and finish that sentence with the word I'm curious. And it shifts you from being in opposition with one person against another person to get to an idea. It shifts you so you're both on the same side and you're starting to talk about it together. It's pretty much magic when it comes to running really big strategy sessions. I've worked with huge companies and with teams that are from all over the world, and they have completely different agendas. EA is one of those places that, they have all these different studios and so many different types of people, and they could easily be working on the same answer in several different departments and not know about it. And then in the room together, they all have their own agenda, and the only way to get all of those people to align is to be curious. Because once you start asking questions and just framing it, well, I'm curious what would happen if this, and I'm curious why you're thinking it this way. And if you just use that word, it completely disarms everything, because curiosity is this natural thing that we all are drawn to, and it invites everyone in the room to be curious instead of just invested in their own right answer. So the thing about curiosity that I find really fascinating, and I did some more research on it, is that it's almost a probability algorithm for your brain. It's this quality where you're actually finding information to contextualize what you already know. So when you have a hunch about something, that's when to pay attention to those hunches and then get curious. When you think, I bet you that's a good idea. It's in those moments where you have those little inklings. Pay attention to those and really hone them, because that is what connects us to creativity. Curiosity is, according to this research, less about what we don't know than what we do know. So very well be curious about a book on astrophysics in, Russian, because it's so different from anything that you've experienced that you'd pick it up and you couldn't be curious. It wouldn't be interesting to you. You'd have no sense of connection with it. But curiosity is more about helping you fill in a patchwork of information about what you already know. So it's about pattern recognition and sort of connecting the dots between things. So when you're trying to solve a problem, honing in on those little inklings where you have a hunch, and then building there and following the information and asking questions that are actually building context around what you already know, that's what curiosity is. Which is interesting, because people might think that curiosity is really about discovering the new, but it's not. It's about adding context to what you already know. Slow down sometimes. So that whole fast win culture that we live in, that's inevitable. That's where we all are. But it's so valuable to slow down just enough, even just for a few moments, and ask yourself what's happening in your body. Ask yourself what's happening with all your senses. Because when we spend all our time on these screens, and when we spend all our time making decisions with less and less information, moving super fast every single day with inboxes that are always overflowing, we don't breathe and we don't connect, and we're not as curious. So slow down. And I don't mean, take a day to slow down. I mean, slow down for a minute. Catch yourself and just breathe. And then ask, what kind of question could I ask right now? What could I learn in that moment? And that is incredibly powerful. One of the things that I've always loved to do is understand the etymology of words. And curiosity, when I looked it up, it comes from Latin, to be careful, to care. Isn't that crazy that word curiosity actually means to take care? You can't take care if you're not going slowly sometimes, right? So in that word, there's the secret. Take care, be careful, go slowly. Staying open is a fascinating one. It's again hard because we're in this information culture where the answer is everywhere. But what I mean by staying open is trying to become aware of where your assumptions are, and realizing that you're making them, which every single day in the work I do is something that catches me by surprise, how many assumptions I have. But I also mean stay open to the fact that there might be a completely different perspective. And there's some simple things that you can do. If you go into your work and you connect with people and you always sit, try standing. Do something different. If you always are somebody who stands and paces and uses the whiteboard, try sitting or try sitting on the floor. It's amazing how much actually physically moving your body to a different location can change your perspective and make you think differently. And it will put you in a little bit of an uncomfortable situation, perhaps, which is, as we also discovered, really good. So staying open and acknowledging that really everything you know might actually be wrong. It can be, probably is. And I was having a conversation with someone yesterday, and he said at one point, everybody's right. And that's not always true. But there's so many ways to get to an answer. There's so many ways to come up with a solution. And if we're not curious, we can't fill in all those contexts. Right now in the world, curiosity is so important, because if we don't start with curiosity, we can't get to a place of empathy. And lastly, what I mean by being greedy is curiosity is the thing that allows you to really suck the marrow out of life. It really is. And I think that people, most of us, we get caught in the flow of things, and we do our day, and then we go home and we figure out what's for dinner, and we start all over the next day, and we don't ask a lot of questions, and we kind of just run on autopilot a bit. Can't help it. But what I mean when I say greedy is this is your life. This is it. And it's so amazing. It's so incredible that we get to do this thing, that we get to be on this planet, that we get to see all these different faces and have all these different ways of experiencing the world. And when you're curious, that's the way you can get the most out of life. It is the absolute secret to living well, is that being curious at that level with each other. So that's really it. This is your chance to get the most from life. Being curious is the way to do it. Right now in the world, I think it's probably more necessary than it's ever been. And like I said, it's more threatened than it's ever been. There you have it. Be curious, ask questions, get uncomfortable, be additive, hone your hunches, slow down, stay open, be greedy for life. Thank you.